What if I told you that in 2014, a massive commercial airliner carrying 239 souls simply vanished into thin air, and despite being the most expensive search operation in aviation history, we still don't know exactly what happened that night when Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 took off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. local time on March 8, 2014. Everything seemed perfectly normal as Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran pilot with over 18,000 flight hours, settled into the cockpit alongside First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid, who was actually on his final training flight before becoming fully qualified to pilot the Boeing 777-200ER aircraft registration 9M MRO that would soon become the center of one of aviation's greatest mysteries. The flight was scheduled as a routine 6-hour journey to Beijing Capital International Airport, with 227 passengers from 14 different nations settling into their seats, completely unaware that they were about to become part of a puzzle that would baffle investigators, governments, and families for years to come as the massive aircraft weighing nearly 300 0 pounds fully loaded with fuel taxied down the runway and lifted off into the humid Malaysian night sky, climbing steadily through 35,000 feet while following the standard flight path over the South China Sea. The first hour and 27 minutes of the flight proceeded exactly as thousands of similar flights do every single day, with routine communications between the aircraft and air traffic control as MH370 crossed from Malaysian airspace into Vietnamese airspace over the Gulf of Thailand. But at exactly 1:19 a.m. something changed forever when Captain Shah, or First Officer Hamid, made what would be the final radio transmission from Flight 370, saying in a calm, professional voice, "Good night, Malaysian 370 to Malaysian Air Traffic Control," before the aircraft was supposed to check in with Vietnamese controllers in Ho Chi Minh City. But that check-in never came, and what happened in the next few minutes would transform a routine commercial flight into one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern history. Because just 2 minutes after that final radio transmission at 1:21 a.m., the aircraft's transponder, which broadcasts the plane's identity, altitude, speed, and location to air traffic control systems, suddenly went silent, leaving controllers staring at their screens as the distinctive blip representing MH370 simply vanished as if the aircraft had been erased from existence. But what air traffic controllers didn't know at that moment was that this wasn't a technical malfunction or system failure, but rather the beginning of a deliberate sequence of actions that would take the Boeing 777 on a ghostly 7-hour journey across the Indian Ocean, while families slept peacefully in their beds, believing their loved ones were safely en route to Beijing. Vietnamese air traffic control waited, expecting to hear from MH370 as the aircraft entered their airspace, but the radio remained silent, and when they tried to contact the flight, there was no response, which prompted them to immediately contact Malaysian controllers asking where the aircraft was, but Malaysian Air Traffic Control had already lost radar contact and assumed the plane had safely transitioned to Vietnamese airspace, creating a dangerous gap in communication that would cost precious hours in the initial response. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came at 2:40 a.m. when Malaysian Airlines dispatch tried to contact MH370 using the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System known as ASARS, but received no response, which was unusual but not immediately alarming since pilots sometimes don't respond to routine messages. But as the hours passed and multiple attempts to reach the aircraft failed, the airline began to realize they had a serious problem on their hands. By 6:30 a.m., when MH370 should have been landing in Beijing, Chinese Air Traffic Control confirmed they had never received any communication from the flight and had no radar contact, which meant that somewhere over the South China Sea, one of the world's most advanced commercial aircraft had simply disappeared with 239 people aboard. The initial search efforts focused on the South China Sea along the planned flight route, with rescue teams from Malaysia, Vietnam, and China launching ships and aircraft to scour the waters for any sign of wreckage, debris, or survivors. But they were looking in completely the wrong place, because unbeknownst to the search teams, MH370 had dramatically changed course after its transponder went dark, turning sharply to the southwest and flying back across the Malaysian peninsula before heading northwest toward the Andaman Sea and then south into the Indian Ocean in what investigators would later determine was a deliberate act by someone with extensive knowledge of aviation and flight systems. The families of the 239 people aboard MH370 gathered at Beijing Capital International Airport expecting to greet their loved ones, but instead found themselves thrust into a nightmare of uncertainty and conflicting information as Malaysian authorities struggled to coordinate the massive search operation while dealing with intense media scrutiny and diplomatic pressure from multiple countries whose citizens were aboard the missing aircraft. Among the passengers were 153 Chinese nationals, along with citizens from Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, France, the United States, Canada, and other nations, creating an international incident that would strain diplomatic relations and expose serious flaws in aviation security and tracking systems. But the human cost was immeasurable as families faced the agonizing reality that their loved ones had simply vanished without explanation or closure. What made the MH370 disappearance so shocking was not just that a modern commercial airliner could vanish, but how it vanished, because this wasn't a case of sudden catastrophic failure or terrorist attack, but rather what appeared to be a carefully planned diversion executed by someone with intimate knowledge of the aircraft, its systems, and commercial aviation procedures. The Boeing 777-200ER is equipped with multiple redundant tracking and communication systems, including primary radar, secondary radar transponders, ACARS data transmission, satellite communications, and emergency beacons, all designed to prevent exactly this type of disappearance, yet somehow every single one of these systems was either turned off or stopped functioning in a sequence that investigators believe was deliberate. The first clue that this was an intentional act came from Malaysian military radar data, which wasn't immediately shared with civilian authorities, but showed that an unidentified aircraft consistent with MH370's size and speed had been tracked flying west across the Malaysian peninsula at 2:22 a.m., approximately 1 hour after the transponder went dark. The military radar showed the aircraft following established aviation waypoints, suggesting the person flying the plane was following legitimate flight paths, rather than flying randomly, which required detailed knowledge of commercial aviation routes and navigation systems. Even more disturbing was the revelation that someone had programmed a sharp left turn into the aircraft's flight management computer before the final radio transmission, which meant the diversion was planned and executed before Captain Shah said, "Good night, Malaysian 370 to Malaysian Air Traffic Control." This discovery sent chills through the aviation community because it suggested that one of the pilots, or possibly an intruder in the cockpit, had been planning this diversion while maintaining normal communications with air traffic control. The aircraft continued flying for nearly 7 more hours after disappearing from civilian radar, following a southern route over the Indian Ocean toward one of the most remote areas of the planet, where the ocean floor drops to depths of more than 12,000 feet, and rescue would be virtually impossible even if survivors existed. The satellite data from British company Inmarsat showed that MH370's engines continued running and the aircraft remained airborne until approximately 8:19 a.m. Malaysian time, when the satellite lost contact, suggesting the plane had finally run out of fuel and crashed into the ocean somewhere along what investigators called the Seventh Arc, a curved line across the southern Indian Ocean, representing all possible locations where the aircraft could have been when it transmitted its final satellite ping. The search for MH370 quickly became the most expensive aviation search in history, with multiple countries contributing ships, aircraft, and personnel to scour millions of square miles of ocean in conditions so harsh that search vessels had to battle 50-foot waves and hurricane-force winds while trying to locate debris from an aircraft that had broken apart upon impact with the water. The initial search area was based on satellite data analysis and drift modeling, but covered an area roughly the size of the continental United States in some of the deepest and most treacherous waters on Earth, where the ocean floor is covered in silt and underwater mountains, making it extremely difficult for sonar and submersible vehicles to operate effectively. Australian authorities coordinated the search operation, designated as the largest search in aviation history, involving assets from Australia, China, Malaysia, and other nations. But after 2 years of intensive searching covering 46,000 square miles of ocean floor, the official search was suspended without finding the main wreckage of MH370. The first confirmed piece of debris from MH370 wasn't found by the official search teams, but by a beachcomber on Reunion Island in the western Indian Ocean, who discovered a large piece of aircraft wing known as a flaperon that had washed ashore nearly 17 months after the disappearance. Subsequent analysis confirmed the debris came from MH370 and showed evidence of high-speed impact with water, but raised more questions than answers, because the damage patterns didn't match what investigators expected from a typical aircraft crash, and suggested the plane may have been in a controlled glide rather than a steep dive when it hit the ocean. Over the following years, more debris pieces washed ashore along coastlines in Madagascar, Mozambique, South Africa, and other locations, providing tantalizing clues about the aircraft's final moments, but never enough evidence to determine exactly what happened during those final hours of flight. The debris analysis revealed that MH370 had indeed crashed in the southern Indian Ocean as the satellite data suggested, but the scattered nature of the wreckage and the fact that pieces continued washing ashore years later indicated that the aircraft had broken apart on impact and been dispersed by ocean currents across thousands of miles of coastline. The Malaysian government faced intense criticism for their handling of the crisis, including delayed information sharing, conflicting statements to the media, and failure to immediately involve international aviation authorities in the investigation, which cost valuable time in the initial search efforts and damaged public confidence in the official investigation. Despite years of investigation involving some of the world's leading aviation experts, forensic analysts, and intelligence agencies, the fate of MH370 remains shrouded in mystery, with several competing theories about what actually happened that night, but no definitive proof of any single explanation. The most widely accepted theory among investigators is that Captain Zaharieh Ahmad Shah deliberately diverted the aircraft for reasons that may never be fully understood, possibly as an elaborate suicide mission or political protest against the Malaysian government. But this theory is based largely on circumstantial evidence, including the captain's flight simulator data, which showed he had practiced flying to the southern Indian Ocean, and his apparent psychological state in the weeks before the flight. The simulator data recovered from Captain Shah's home computer showed that he had practiced a very similar flight path to what MH370 actually followed, including flying the aircraft to fuel exhaustion over the southern Indian Ocean, but his family and colleagues insisted he was a dedicated professional pilot who loved flying and had no apparent motive for such a devastating act. However, investigators noted that the precise execution of the diversion, including the timing of the transponder shutdown and the aircraft's navigation along established waypoints, suggested someone with Captain Shah's level of expertise and intimate knowledge of the Boeing 777 systems. Alternative theories include the possibility that First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid was responsible for the diversion, perhaps as part of a personal crisis or radicalization, but investigators found less evidence supporting this scenario. Some experts have proposed that the aircraft was hijacked by passengers or outside parties who gained access to the cockpit. But this theory struggles to explain how hijackers would have the technical knowledge to disable multiple aircraft systems and execute such a sophisticated flight plan without being detected by air traffic control. Other theories suggest mechanical failure or fire could have incapacitated the crew while leaving the aircraft capable of continued flight. But these scenarios don't adequately explain why the aircraft made deliberate course changes and flew for hours in the wrong direction. The cargo manifest showed that MH370 was carrying a shipment of lithium batteries, which some theorists suggested could have caused a fire or explosion. But investigators determined that the batteries were properly packaged and declared, according to regulations, making this an unlikely cause of the disappearance. The lack of distress calls, emergency transponder signals, or any communication from the aircraft during the 7-hour flight strongly suggests that whatever happened was sudden and either incapacitated the crew immediately or was carried out by someone who deliberately chose not to communicate with ground authorities. However, investigators noted that the precise execution of the diversion, including the timing of the transponder shutdown and the aircraft's navigation along established waypoints, suggested someone with Captain Shah's level of expertise and intimate knowledge of the Boeing 777 systems. Alternative theories include the possibility that First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid was responsible for the diversion, perhaps as part of a personal crisis or radicalization, but investigators found less evidence supporting this scenario. Some experts have proposed that the aircraft was hijacked by passengers or outside parties who gained access to the cockpit. But this theory struggles to explain how hijackers would have the technical knowledge to disable multiple aircraft systems and execute such a sophisticated flight plan without being detected by air traffic control. Other theories suggest mechanical failure or fire could have incapacitated the crew while leaving the aircraft capable of continued flight, but these, despite years of investigation involving some of the world's leading aviation experts, forensic analysts, and intelligence agencies, the fate of MH370 remains shrouded in mystery, with several competing theories about what actually happened that night, but no definitive proof of any single explanation. The most widely accepted theory among investigators is that Captain Zaharieh Ahmad Shah deliberately diverted the aircraft for reasons that may never be fully understood, possibly as an elaborate suicide mission or political protest against the Malaysian government. But this theory is based largely on circumstantial evidence, including the captain's flight simulator data, which showed he had practiced flying to the southern Indian Ocean and his apparent psychological state in the weeks before the flight. The simulator data recovered from Captain Shah's home computer showed that he had practiced a very similar flight path to what MH370 actually followed, including flying the aircraft to fuel exhaustion over the southern Indian Ocean. But his family and colleagues insisted he was a dedicated professional pilot who loved flying and had no apparent motive for such a devastating act. Scenarios don't adequately explain why the aircraft made deliberate course changes and flew for hours in the wrong direction. The cargo manifest showed that MH370 was carrying a shipment of lithium batteries, which some theorists suggested could have caused a fire or explosion, but investigators determined that the batteries were properly packaged and declared according to regulations, making this an unlikely cause of the disappearance. The lack of distress calls, emergency transponder signals, or any communication from the aircraft during the 7-hour flight strongly suggests that whatever happened was sudden and either incapacitated the crew immediately or was carried out by someone who deliberately chose not to communicate with ground authorities. The incident led to immediate changes in international aviation regulations, including requirements for more frequent position reporting over remote areas, enhanced tracking systems for aircraft operating over oceans, and improved coordination between civilian and military air traffic control agencies. But these changes came too late for the families of MH370, its passengers and crew who continued to demand answers about what happened to their loved ones. The emotional toll on the families has been devastating, with many refusing to accept that their relatives are dead without seeing definitive proof of the aircraft's fate, leading to years of legal battles with Malaysian Airlines and the Malaysian government over compensation and disclosure of investigation details. Some families have hired private investigators and funded independent search efforts, convinced that the official investigation has missed crucial evidence or been compromised by political considerations. The case has also spawned countless conspiracy theories, ranging from claims that the aircraft was shot down by military forces to suggestions that it was hijacked and landed at a secret location with passengers being held captive. But none of these alternative theories have produced credible evidence or adequately explained the satellite data and debris recovery. The official investigation report released by Malaysian authorities concluded that the evidence was insufficient to determine with certainty what caused MH370 to deviate from its planned route, but stated that the evidence suggested the aircraft was under manual control when it changed course, which implies deliberate human intervention rather than mechanical failure or hijacking. However, the report was criticized by aviation experts and family members for failing to reach definitive conclusions and for not adequately addressing questions about the captain's possible involvement or the Malaysian government's initial response to the crisis. The mystery of MH370 continues to haunt the aviation industry, and the families of those who disappeared serving as a stark reminder that even in our highly connected world, some questions may never be answered, and some people may simply vanish without explanation, leaving behind only fragments of debris scattered across an endless ocean, and the enduring pain of those who loved them, wondering what really happened during those final terrifying hours when Flight MH370 flew into oblivion and became aviation's greatest unsolved mystery that challenges everything we thought we knew about modern air travel safety and our ability to track and protect the people who trust us with their lives. When they board an aircraft and disappear into the night sky,